In this roundup of the week, Britain takes action against a COVID-19 second wave. Even though there's no sign of a second wave, President Trump shuts down government training about how white people are irredeemably racist, and the UK's Citizens' Assembly tells the government what to do about climate change. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Welcome back to the mandatory health and safety training course that is 2020. I hope you're well and even thriving in the face of, well, everything that life is throwing at you, and a special thought particularly for the good people, heck, even the bad people living in the area most affected at the moment by the massive fires on the US West Coast. Here's a map showing air quality out there right now. That's not a place where you want to be. Caused by multiple fires burning across more than 3 million acres, according to reports. As you would expect, this is leading many to talk about the impact of climate change. Some in measured tones, some like Nancy Pelosi in more hubristic ones, on the theme of Mother Nature is angry. The hot spells in California are examples of the sort of things that are expected to happen more often in the future as the average global temperature rises. The trouble is that if you're focusing on California, you also end up talking about the actions taken in the name of climate change. One of the things that hasn't made things better during the sweltering heat has been California experiencing a number of power outages. Some have blamed the Californian state government for focusing on renewable energy generation while closing nuclear power stations as well as fossil fuel plants. It's a bit more complicated than that, but the truth is that if you can't keep the power on when people most need it, you should expect that people will blame your policies. A basic requirement for effective action to decarbonise the power grid has to be that in so doing, you don't make it less stable. Early incompetence will discredit your policies faster than anything else. But there's little chance of having that conversation this side of November, so let's move on. Because the rest of the world is still gripped by the challenge of COVID-19. And in a number of parts of the world, that's actually quite a rational thing to be. Peru has overtaken Belgium as the major country with the highest deaths per million in the world from the coronavirus. Death rates have been plateaued for a while, but are plateaued at quite a high level. And sadly, South America generally is struggling with this. The 10 worst countries for deaths per capita now in descending order are Peru, Belgium, Spain, Chile, Bolivia, the UK, Brazil, Ecuador, and the US. Now, the people who are against lockdowns have been pointing at Peru because it's the worst hit country, but it was one of the earliest to lock down on March the 16th, in fact. And it tried at least to lock down hard. So how come? How come if they lock down early and lock down hard that they are so badly hit? Is it perhaps true that lockdowns don't work? Well, it may or may not be true, but Peru probably is not the proof of it one way or the other. As always, there are many factors at play. You can't just look at the one that suits you and draw your conclusions from it. Although the government may have been firm on its lockdown and it may have gone early, it has practically been impossible for large numbers of people in Peru to comply. For one thing, many don't own refrigerators and they have to buy fresh food daily. The markets have therefore remained bustling in spite of curfews, and reportedly they have been COVID hotspots as a result. 7 out of 10 Peruvian workers are in the informal sector and are dependent on daily earnings and can't afford to isolate. So it can't just be whether or not a lockdown is imposed, but also whether it is effective. And by all accounts, Peru simply doesn't have the systems, the institutions, nor the infrastructure to make it so. Also, the health service in Peru is badly resourced, with just 3 ICU beds per 100,000 people, and that's a factor in a higher than usual death rate from COVID-19. However, countries that are not badly hit right now are those in Europe, like the UK. But when it comes to public policy, you'd think it was the reverse, because politicians remain hypnotised by case rates and oblivious to lack of hospitalisations or death rates. Case rates are spiralling upwards, the R number has crept above 1, panic roams the land once more. The UK government provoked outrage from some this week when it imposed more stringent restrictions banning any gatherings inside or out of more than 6 people. So this picture definitely shouldn't be happening next week. They shut down the city of Birmingham and added Merseyside to the watch list where they might do the same soon. But there is a shining hope in sight, because they also announced that they'd be introducing a new moonshot-level ambitious programme, something of awesome scale, attempting the impossible, just like sending people to the moon. Almost exactly like sending people to the moon. It would cost something like £100 billion. Presumably, we'll be watching this astonishing marvel of human endeavour glued to the TV screens, we will be. And yes, you guessed it, it's a moonshot that looks rather like a massive programme of COVID-19 testing. Rapid testing for 10 million people a day. And you can absolutely understand why you would undertake this huge, costly, ambitious project. I mean, just take a look at these awful death figures on this graph. And apologies to those who just listened to the audio version of the show, we're looking at a graph with almost no deaths for months. Unfortunately, the statisticians have been kicking back against the project, pointing out that even with a false positive rate of only 1 or 2%, if millions of people are being tested per day, that would mean tens of thousands of people would be subjected to economic harm for no good reason. France is also considering urgent measures, but this week a senior advisor to the French government said that around 90% of their positive test results are likely to be false positives. At some point you have to ask when that dawning realisation that this is not a second wave is going to kick into public policy. In one of his latest videos, Ivor Cummins draws attention to the Euromomo graphs on excess deaths across Europe, covering 360 million people. It shows the 2018 flu season with excess deaths for those above the age of 65 in the region of 120,000. A slightly smaller spike for the 2019 season. And then when we got to the 2020 season, up until the arrival of COVID-19, we actually had a very low excess deaths bump from the annual flu season, leaving a lot of vulnerable people who would have been susceptible to that flu untouched and sadly ready for COVID-19 to find them instead. The total excess deaths for around the age of 65 was about 167,000 people, slightly up on those usual totals, but not that disproportionately. This graph by Chris Hope shows that there is a strong correlation between how hard countries got hit by COVID-19 and how mild a flu season they had in the previous couple of years. Again, strongly suggesting that what COVID-19 did was, unfortunately, tragically for some, clean up on the people who would have been vulnerable to a stronger flu season in any case. It's important context to at least consider as governments are looking at case rates, not death rates, and they're making decisions that are going to affect people. And it matters because, as this graph shows, we are now starting to see a wholly expected uptick in deaths from cancer. From the level we saw last year, a lot of people whose treatments have been postponed, undiagnosed or otherwise deprioritised while everyone's chasing COVID. I talk about the rules of being an effective change maker, the first of which is that you need to see the world clearly so you understand what actually needs changing and not get fooled into following a mainstream narrative if it isn't supported by data. Right now we could do some cool heads at government levels worldwide taking exactly that principle to heart. That's actually a good lead into the next item, because this week President Trump drew attention to the interesting world of anti-racism training by banning it for federal agencies and calling it a sickness. It's not just any old training, but specifically that which uses what's described as critical race theory. Here was the memo to the heads of executive departments and agencies from Russell Vought, the director of the President's office. It has come to the President's attention that executive branch agencies have spent millions of taxpayer dollars to date training government workers to believe divisive anti-American propaganda. For example, according to press reports, employees across the executive branch have been required to attend trainings where they are told that virtually all white people contribute to racism, or where they're required to say that they benefit from racism. According to press reports, in some cases, these trainings have further claimed that there is racism embedded in the belief that America is the land of opportunity, or the belief that the most qualified person should receive a job. The move probably followed from a segment on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News, where Chris Rufo called on the president to take exactly this action. On his blog, Rufo had revealed documents he said had been sent to him by a whistleblower, drawing from diversity training at the US Treasury Department. Titled Difficult Conversations About Race in Troubling Times, it begins like this. It is imperative at this time that people who are white invest in race-based growth and development on topics such as systemic racism, civil rights history, unconscious bias, inclusion and contemporary ideology such as anti-racism, intersectionality, white privilege and white fragility. The materials start with the premise that virtually all white people contribute to racism and tells white managers to create safe spaces where black employees can explain what it means to be black and to be seen in their pain. White staff are instructed to keep silent and sit in the discomfort of their racism. That, of course, is not what training looks like at all. Training to do with the development of skills that have an application in the workplace. But this is to do with indoctrination, introducing the principles of a prevailing ideology, how to think correctly, not how to do a job of work. Even if you agreed with the ideology behind critical race theory, you should be able to recognise it's the sort of belief that is debated, not enforced through training. Because this is a radical notion. The idea that when we all bought into Martin Luther King's dream of a world where people were judged not by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character, what that actually meant was that we were being racist. Because that's the current line. And holding up organised and effective ways of working as being desirable, well, that's actually racist as well. Because all those characteristics that experience and history has shown to be correlated with personal success, those are actually features of white supremacy. So trying to coach young black students to embrace behaviours that have historically helped people like them to be successful, that is actually to be discouraged. One might argue that such a position is idiotic, self-defeating and highly damaging to anyone who becomes persuaded by it. But let's rein that back and say that it is at the very least counterintuitive and lacking a base of evidence in its ability to deliver positive outcomes. That is already reason why it would not form a basis of training for these organisations. The consultant who provides this training has been delivering these sorts of services to the US government since 2006. In 2011, he billed $3 million for consulting services, and NASA paid $500,000 for power and privilege sexual orientation workshops, which may explain how Elon Musk can take people into space for a much lower cost than NASA can these days. Maybe. It's not just in the US, apparently. In the UK, Parliament has similarly spent taxpayers' money on unconscious bias training courses for members of Parliament. According to reports, the training will school MPs on words to avoid and update them on woke-friendly history, which may not be wholly identical with the history they learned at school. I'm not sure whether this predates or is the result of the opposition leader Keir Starmer's recent embarrassment. He committed the crime of referring to the Black Lives Matter moment, and apparently using the word moment was very, very bad, which led him to promise that he and his party's entire staff would undergo unconscious bias training. Either way, the exercise attracted particular tabloid derision for the fact that it uses a giant blue puppet called UB as part of such unconscious bias training. That bit gave me a shock of recognition, I must admit. I've recruited about 15 people in my time. Not once did I ever recruit a blue puppet. So clearly I have a lot to learn. Take my money! Except it would be rather a lot of money, because the total cost of unconscious bias training is thought to have reached up to around about £700,000, about $900,000. Apparently, nearly 40,000 civil servants have received unconscious bias training over the last 5 years. Now, as far as I've been able to tell, the UK trainings are not based explicitly on critical race theory. alleging that all white people are irredeemably racist and every organisation systemically racist. And the idea of unconscious bias training comes from the corporate world, and it arises from a real concern. If you're a committee that's genuinely committed to diversity, which is a good thing in terms of straightforward equal opportunities, what is the evidence that there may be discrimination holding your progress back? And if there is, what can you do about it? Whilst mocking the bad, you need to recognise that they arose originally trying to answer a genuine and serious question. I have conversations with corporate people to this day for whom the received wisdom is that unconscious bias training is something their company needs to get better outcomes. A survey back in 2015 suggested that 20% of corporations had provided those sorts of workshops. That gives you some idea how deeply this has penetrated into the corporate psyche. Do all the executives who bring in these programs believe in them? Probably not. Some are probably simply ensuring that the company's seen to be trying its best as some sort of a defence when its lack of progress is highlighted. Others have testified that in their workplace it's used like a punishment. Oh, you failed to hire enough women in this round. Well, now everybody has to do unconscious bias training again. Which sounds a bit like the whole class having to do detention at school. But others no doubt do it because they genuinely think they have a problem. And they have been told that this is the way to solve it. At the heart of it is something called the Implicit Association Test, IAT, which is claimed to measure your unconscious prejudice. Unfortunately, all the evidence suggests that there is one small problem with the IAT. It doesn't work. A 2017 meta-analysis that looked at 494 previous studies found that this sort of training could adjust the scores that people register on implicit bias tests, but achieving those changes made no practical difference to people's actual behaviour. Patrick Forscher, a psychology professor who was initially a believer in such training, said this: "I was pretty shocked that the meta-analysis found so little evidence of a change in behaviour that corresponded with a change in implicit bias. I currently believe that many but not all psychologists, in their desire to help solve social problems, have been way too overconfident in their interpretation of the evidence that they gather. I count myself in that number." 4 other meta-analyses carried out between 2009 and 2015, examining between 46 and 67 individual studies, all concluded that the IAT was a weak predictor of behaviour. So you might ask why it's even a thing. And the answer remains that companies want to feel like they're doing something. And if not this, then what? Give them something more effective and they'll probably embrace it. What they're not prepared to do as corporations is challenge the underlying notion to this sort of training, which is that everybody is, just a little bit of a bigot. Unfortunately, that doesn't take you anywhere useful. At the end of the day, what has a better track record of working is focusing on systems, not individuals, and getting voluntary participation from people in setting goals and solving problems. But that's not the modern way. Something went badly wrong? Okay, make it mandatory that all these people go on a course. Once they've been properly educated, no doubt they'll have had their thinking aligned with the right way to see the world. And if you were a real cynic, I'm sure you're not, but if you were, that might also be how you would see the phenomenon of citizens' assemblies. In the UK this week, we saw the launch of the final report of the UK Parliamentary Citizens' Assembly on climate change. If you haven't been following this, a Citizens' Assembly is a panel of people selected sort of at random, but in a way that gives you a final group that's demographically representative of the population in terms of age, gender, race, location, that sort of thing. You then set them a question, give them lots of inputs from the recognised experts on that question, and then let them discuss and come back with their recommendations. In theory, they are a good consultative mechanism. And they're mostly topical because Extinction Rebellion have been saying that they should be put in charge of policy on climate change. Although in their version they wouldn't be consultative, they'd actually usurp the role of Parliament, which of course is bonkers on many levels, the detail of which I go into in a previous video. Anyway, one was set up by 6 parliamentary select committees, given the task of coming back with recommendations on how the UK could meet its current target of getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. That group presented its final report this week, and it created a mini buzz, with the BBC deciding it had come out with some very radical things, other people suggesting that it wasn't even close to radical. I provide a link to the full thing in the video description. When I'm looking at it, I'm considering what I understand to have been the premise and the intended value of the exercise. The government already has experts advising it on how to decarbonise the grid, for instance. There's nothing much a group like this is really going to be able to contribute to a highly technical question like that. But what it does do is it gives you some insights into the preferences people will show on the things that most directly affect them. And you know what this group really wasn't buying? It really wasn't buying nanny state top-down control measures to rule their lives. They were up for moves to increase the uptake in infrastructure for electric vehicles. They weren't up for measures to take traffic off the roads. I quote, "Assembly members recommended a future which minimises restrictions on travel and lifestyles, placing the emphasis on shifting to electric vehicles and improving public transport rather than on large reductions in car use." What else? They weren't up for being told you can't go on a foreign holiday or visit family members who are living overseas. They were up for pushing to improve the technology behind flying and discouraging frequent flying with a charge of some sort. I quote, "Assembly members would like to see a solution to air travel emissions that allows people to continue to fly. Assembly members felt that this would protect people's freedom and happiness, as well as having benefits for business and the economy." Happiness! Who'd have thought it? It goes on to say that they did recognise there had to be some constraints on growth of air travel. And so on. There were a number of areas. I suggest you look at the full thing. The themes and values that the Assembly members agreed on were these. 1. The need for more education, spread some of the things that they'd learned about so that other people could also make informed decisions. 2. Fairness. Don't penalise the people at the bottom of the pyramid. Do your best to protect jobs in the transition. 3. Freedom and choice. Give us options, not orders. 4. Realising co-benefits. 5. Restoring nature. 6. Strong cross-party political leadership on the issue. That sounds easy. And 7. A joined-up approach across society. Government and various agencies were all highly complimentary of the work that had been done and some of the ideas that had come out. People on both extremes of the debate, they hated it. Skeptics complained that no skeptics had had input into the panel. Extinction Rebellion people complained that no zero by 2025 true believers had had input into the panel. And that's one of the things that I discussed in that previous video. The power for this sort of exercise lies in deciding what question gets framed and which experts get to input into the panel at the start. In this case, there were a number of scientists and serious people. There were a couple of campaigners in there. There were discussions at points that people disagree about. It wasn't all just laid out. But the question they were asked was, how could the UK move to net zero by 2050? Because that's the current plan. So no, they didn't have inputs from people who would basically have wanted to say that was the wrong question. I kind of think that's to be expected. Nevertheless, even with that parameter, there was no sign of the sharp radicalism that Extinction Rebellion had always assumed a citizens' assembly would deliver. There were only a couple of proposals that were put forward that the assembly did not support. One of them was that the target date should be brought forward from 2050. They didn't support that. They could have done. And because this was genuinely a cross-section of people, it included people who started off sceptical of climate change, more concerned about their jobs than all the rest, as well as some of those who were very concerned about the issue. You got a wide variety of positions and perspectives going in. And that's what you want from this sort of consultative body. It's kind of the whole point of it, in fact. But no, that group then isn't going to suddenly become a frothing at the mouth bunch of wild-eyed radicals as soon as they get a presentation from David Attenborough. I suggested to the XR supporter who will be standing in the London mayor elections next year, Rosalind Reedhead, for this meant they needed to do the work on what they actually wanted now, rather than simply saying that citizens' assemblies would do it for them. Well, she delivered the goods. Here are some of the items from the manifesto she will be running on. 1. A customised pathway to net zero carbon 2025 for every Londoner. Job transition, retraining and net zero carbon lifestyle counselling. Every Londoner. What happens with Londoners who tell her to shove her counselling is not spelled out. What jobs they're retrained for that are suddenly going to appear in London is also not spelled out. 2. A low-tech Green New Deal. This involves removing all fossil fuel cars and investing in an emergency cycling network. Lorries replaced where possible by cargo bikes and sail cargo. Sounds challenging? 3. A town fund and a karma tax to pay for the New Deal and a core basic income for every citizen. What's a karma tax? I asked and was told it's a tax on historic carbon emissions. It's apparently going to deliver free money for everyone. And 4. A redistribution of housing. We can't afford the upfront carbon emissions of new homes. We have enough housing stock. It is just unequally and unevenly distributed. Remember, this is just the London Mayor position. Last time I looked, the London Mayor does not have the power to seize your property to redistribute it as she sees fit. Even if you're some fat millionaire living on your own in a huge mansion, the Mayor cannot then put you in a small flat in a tower block and hand your mansion over to, I don't know, families of refugees or whoever she had in mind. But do you know what? Good for her. Spelling out what has been obvious all along. If you're going to argue for net zero by 2025, you're signing up to some completely off-the-wall propositions, by definition. It's easy to snipe at measured, achievable proposals and say, oh, too little, too late, when you don't have to say instead what you would do. Well, this is what it looks like when you do work it out. How many Londoners do we think are going to vote for that programme? What citizens' assembly do they imagine would go into a locked room and then come out carrying these proposals? The actual proposals from this citizens' assembly this week have shot Extinction Rebellion's rabbit. They have no platform left, which doesn't mean they'll admit it or even realise it. But there it is. Now, last week's video I thought was pretty inoffensive from a YouTube perspective, but with an hour or so going live, it got demonetised. I appealed, and I later found that YouTube had looked at it and confirmed the demonetisation on appeal. No reason given. But when I looked at it again an hour later, it had magically been restored and was showing ads again. How does any of this work? I have no idea. But it does make me immensely grateful for the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Their support means I can continue to make videos on the subjects that most matter, whether or not they suit YouTube advertisers. If you would like to join the good people who already support the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce on this channel, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.